This Friday will mark 8 years of civil war in Syria. CBSN will take a deeper dive into the conflict every day this week with in-depth analysis from experts and reflections from our correspondents who have reported there. Today, we begin with a look at the numbers. Since 2011, almost 368,000 people have died. Another 192,000 are either missing or presumed dead. And as of December 2018, almost 40% of deaths are directly related to the fighting. The conflict has also created what many call the worst refugee crisis in the world. At least 6.2 million Syrians are internally displaced, while another 5.7 million have sought refuge abroad. And overall, 13 million people are believed to be in dire need of humanitarian aid there. And there are many questions that still linger as we enter 8 years of conflict. How will this war end? When will people be able to return home? Unfortunately, there are no easy answers. And joining me now from Beirut is Jasmine El-Gamal. She is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former Middle East advisor for the Pentagon. Jasmine, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate you here with us. If you could walk us through the start of this conflict, how did a peaceful uprising inspired by the Arab Spring turn into 8 years of full-fledged war?
It really is a tragedy when you think about it and when you look at what's happened over the last 8 years, Tanya. And I think the easiest way to describe it is that it was just a lot of pent-up anger and frustration on the part of the Syrian people towards the regime. They tried to go out into the streets and express their desires peacefully, but the regime overreacted. This is a regime that has never really tolerated any kind of dissent or any kind of protest whatsoever, any kind of criticism of the regime. So when people went out into the streets and started protesting, the regime responded in a very, very heavy-handed manner. And if you'll remember, this really started with 4 boys in Daraa, which is in the south of Syria, writing on the wall the same slogan that was used in the Egyptian revolution, which is "the people want the fall of the regime." Now, these were kids. Obviously, you know, I don't know that they really knew what they were writing, but they knew that they wanted to emulate something incredible that was happening around the region. Across society, people started becoming angrier, going out into the streets, and then the regime would overreact. They would end up killing people. Then more people would go out into the streets, and so on and so forth, until you got to a point where there was just a massive conflict. I mean, there was a security void at a certain point in time when the military was fighting all of these protesters, which provided an opportunity for foreign fighters to come in from other places, and then that led very quickly to where you see now foreign fighters, obviously the rise of ISIS as a result of that, and then foreign intervention and so on. It's impossible to kind of summarize in a short period of time, but as you can see, it was just basically one chain reaction, a series of events happening one after the other that were very quickly uncontrollable.
And as you said, it has become since then much more complicated by the variety of players who are now involved in the situation. I want to ask you about President Assad, because he has been in power since his father died in 2000. The West has labeled him a brutal dictator, but there are those in his country who do support him, especially in certain areas of the country. How has he been able to keep power for so long?
Well, I think it's through a combination of measures. I mean, as with any strong man, you have a combination of repression, buying the loyalties of people around you if they're not from your sect, placing them in very high positions so that you don't have to feel in danger from the people surrounding you, and then just broad intimidation and persecution of anyone who dares try to challenge your rule. So that's what we've seen in Syria with this president. President Assad is an Alawite. It's a very small community in Syria. It's a minority. And so he has surrounded himself and staffed the highest positions of his government and his military with fellow Alawites who are loyal to him and to the system that they rule over. He also placed, Sunni loyalists around him as well, took care of the businessmen and the business community so that they wouldn't have a reason to protest. And then anyone else that dared protest was brutally put down. And so that's how he's managed to maintain his rule thus far.
Jasmine, let's talk about America's role in this conflict. As we said earlier, there are so many players. But on the one hand, the U.S. has criticized Assad and even launched airstrikes over his use of chemical weapons. But the U.S. has also shared a goal of defeating ISIS with other players in this Syrian war. So how complicated is America's involvement?
It's been quite complicated, and it's changed a bit over the years. And so you'll remember that a few months after the uprising began and it started to become really violent, President Obama called for President Assad to step down. That was a huge shift in our policy, the previous few months of our policy, where we wouldn't really say anything. So after he called for Assad to step down, there was a lot of criticism, and in some cases rightly so, that the U.S. didn't really do anything about that. We said that we wanted the President Assad to step down, but we didn't really take any steps to make it happen. You'll remember that President Obama at the time had campaigned on ending U.S. involvement in the Middle East. And so the last thing he wanted, and I think the last thing that the American people wanted, was for the U.S. to get involved in another war. And so because of all of these different factors, we didn't really go in and try to, make sure that President Assad was either removed from power or that the opposition had a chance to remove him from power. Of course, fast forward 6 to 7 years later, now we have ISIS on the ground, which is absolutely a security threat to the United States and to American citizens. So the United States started stepping up its involvement, trying to defeat ISIS in Syria so that they wouldn't have the capability to threaten U.S. interests either abroad or here at home.
A little then about the current situation. ISIS seems to be on its heels, or at least retreating, if not fully defeated, at least retreating. It appears that the Assad regime has managed to put down most of the rebel activity. But we continue to see the devastating images of Syrian cities destroyed by all of these years of war. What is next for Syria? Can the country rebuild itself, and what do you see as the likely path forward?
I think it's a really difficult question, but I'll make a couple of points here. What we're seeing is that President Assad, with the assistance of the Russians and the Iranians, who are his allies, has managed to regain almost full control of vast parts of the country. And so as he starts to consolidate his control, and as more and more areas fall under regime control, I think you will see a sort of at least very superficial semblance of stability in the country as he consolidates his gains. Now, what that means for people living there, it probably means that they're going to unfortunately go back to a state very much like the one they were living in before, except now you have immense devastation, both physically and emotionally, that people have gone through over the last 8 years. People have had relatives disappeared. You have people who have been jailed, tortured, killed, disappeared. All of those things are going to have to be dealt with moving forward. But looking at it from the outside, I would say that the international community, even though it's very supportive of the new UN Special Envoy's political efforts to put forth a plan for elections and a political transition, I think what we might see in the near future is sort of a consolidation of support under the Assad regime and a return to the very repressive kind of state that people lived in before.
A repressive state, but now with great need for humanitarian aid. Jasmine El-Gamal, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Tanya.
Our reporting on Syria continues tomorrow with a closer look at how the fight against ISIS has impacted the country.